On a crisp October morning in 2018, David Martinez and his teenage son Jake set out on what should have been a simple 3-day camping trip in the Great Smoky Mountains. They promised to be home by Sunday. But Sunday came and went, and they never returned. Their truck was found abandoned at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of David or Jake. Search teams scoured 50 square miles of rugged wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers poured in from across Tennessee. Yet it was as if father and son had simply vanished into thin air. For years, theories swirled. Had they gotten lost? Attacked by wildlife? Or had David staged their disappearance? No one could say for sure. Then 5 years later, a researcher's drone flying over one of the most dangerous, untouched valleys of the Smokies captured something no one was prepared to see. What that footage revealed not only solved the mystery, but exposed a truth so shocking it would divide an entire family forever. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you're fascinated by real-life mysteries like this one, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unbelievable story we uncover. It was the morning of October 12, 2018 in Knoxville, Tennessee. The sun rose over quiet suburban streets, where the Martinez family lived in a modest 3-bedroom home at the edge of town. From the outside they seemed like an ordinary family, but inside life carried its share of ups and downs. David Martinez, 42, worked as a carpenter, picking up long hours and side jobs just to cover bills. His wife, Sarah, was the heart of the household, balancing her work as a dental receptionist with raising their 2 children. Jake, just 9 years old, and his little sister Emily, 5. The kids were inseparable. Emily looked up to her big brother, trailing behind him everywhere he went. Jake, bright-eyed and curious, had recently taken a big interest in the outdoors. He loved listening to his dad's stories about hiking and camping, and this trip, just the 2 of them, felt like the adventure of a lifetime. That morning, Sarah folded sandwiches into a cooler while Jake bounded through the living room, wearing a backpack almost too big for his small frame. His favorite stuffed keychain dangled from the zipper, something he insisted on bringing along. David loaded up their silver Ford pickup truck, carefully packing sleeping bags, a second-hand tent, and enough gear for a 3-day camping trip. Neighbors later remembered seeing them leave, David with his serious, quiet expression, Jake grinning from ear to ear, waving out the window as the truck rolled away. Sarah stood in the driveway watching until they disappeared down the street. "Be safe," she whispered, not knowing it was the last time she'd ever see them. By midday, their truck was parked at a remote Smoky Mountain trailhead, one of the lesser-known routes far from crowded campsites. A ranger would later confirm spotting the pair tightening their backpacks before stepping onto the trail. A father leading the way. A boy just 9 years old following close behind, excited, trusting, unaware of what lay ahead. They were supposed to return home by Sunday, October 15th. But Sunday came and went. Sarah's calls went unanswered. The truck was still at the trailhead, doors unlocked, keys sitting in the ignition. No footprints. No trail of belongings. No trace of where they had gone. It was as if the mountains had swallowed them whole. When Sunday night arrived and David and little Jake still hadn't returned, Sarah Martinez tried to calm herself. Maybe they'd stayed an extra night to enjoy the mountains. Maybe they were just running late. But as the minutes dragged into hours, her anxiety grew heavier. By 9 p.m., her calls went straight to voicemail. By midnight, she knew something was terribly wrong. At dawn, her worst fear drove her to pick up the phone. Within hours, emergency crews gathered at the trailhead of Cataract Falls. And there it was, David's silver pickup truck, sitting in the same spot where Sarah had watched them drive away 3 days earlier. The sight was unsettling. The doors were unlocked. The keys were still resting in the ignition. Inside the cab, half-eaten food sat untouched in a cooler. It was as if David and Jake had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. Search dogs were deployed, their handlers giving commands as the animals sniffed the ground, circling the truck, then pulling toward the trail. At first there was relief. Finally, a lead. The dogs followed the scent confidently for over a mile. Rangers pushed deeper into the woods, marking trees, calling out their names. But then, everything changed. The dogs slowed, their noses darting left and right, their bodies stiffening. Handlers urged them on, but the trail was gone. The dogs whined, circled, and finally sat back in confusion. It was as if the scent had been cut off in the middle of nowhere. How could that be possible? With no footprints, no signs of a struggle, no torn clothing or dropped gear, the forest gave back nothing. For the next 72 hours, the Smoky Mountains came alive with search efforts. Dozens of rangers, sheriff's deputies, and volunteers scoured every ravine, every cave, every stream crossing. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights cutting through the thick canopy, but from the air, the forest looked like a never-ending green ocean. On the ground, searchers shouted their names, their voices echoing off the ridges. David. Jake. No answer. Not even the faintest reply. Hope faded quickly. The weather turned against them. Cold rain swept across the mountains, followed by an unusual early snow. The trails grew slick. Streams swelled into dangerous currents. Searchers pressed on, but the elements made every step more dangerous. By the end of the first week, the scale of the operation had expanded. More than 50 square miles were combed by foot. Volunteers came from Knoxville, even as far as Chattanooga, to lend their hands. News crews gathered at the trailhead, broadcasting updates that drew in viewers across the state. And yet, nothing. Not a shoe print. Not a scrap of clothing. Not even a single candy wrapper from Jake's backpack. It was as if father and son had been erased from the mountains. And with no trace to follow, investigators began to whisper the unthinkable. Was this truly an accident? Or had David Martinez planned something far more disturbing? For days, the Smoky Mountains swallowed every effort to find David and Jake. Search teams pressed on, but the silence was deafening. And then, when investigators began turning over stones in David's personal life, the story took an unsettling turn. On the surface, David Martinez appeared to be the picture of a devoted father. He lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on the outskirts of Knoxville. A quiet suburban neighborhood where kids rode bikes in the cul-de-sac and neighbors waved from their porches. David had lived there for years, raising Jake with his ex-wife, Sarah. By trade, David was a construction foreman. Strong, capable, respected by his crew. He was also a proud Eagle Scout, known in the community for leading weekend hikes with local boys, teaching them survival skills and the beauty of the outdoors. To most people, David wasn't just familiar with the mountains, he was at home in them. The official search lasted just over a month. For more than 30 days, rescue teams had scoured every cave, every ravine, every stream in a 50-square-mile radius. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dogs were deployed again and again, and volunteers poured in from across Tennessee. But still, no trace. On November 15, 2018, exactly 1 month after David and Jake disappeared, the search was officially called off. Rangers packed up their equipment. Volunteers went home. The command post at the trailhead was dismantled. For most, it was over. But for Sarah Martinez, the nightmare was only beginning. The first year was a blur of false hope. Sarah refused to let the case die. She organized her own monthly search parties. Friends, neighbors, church members, anyone willing to walk those trails with her. She carried Jake's photo in her backpack, showing it to hikers, asking if they'd seen him. A private investigator was hired, combing through tips and scraps of evidence. Every few months, a lead surfaced. A gas station in North Carolina caught a man and a boy on camera. Grainy footage, blurry faces. A truck stop waitress swore she saw them heading south. A camper reported hearing 2 voices deep in the woods. Each time, Sarah rushed to follow up. Each time, it ended in disappointment. Not one of those leads was real. The community, though, didn't forget. Annual memorial hikes were organized in Jake and David's honor. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, showed up with backpacks and boots, walking the trails together, chanting their names. Jake's high school friends made posters, and a scholarship fund was started in his name for students who loved the outdoors. But as the years dragged on, the optimism began to fade. Miguel, David's brother, tried to keep Sarah grounded. Over coffee one morning, he finally said what no one wanted to admit. "Sarah, they're gone." David would have reached out by now if he could. Something happened up there. Sarah stared at him, tears in her eyes. "You don't know that. What if they're alive? What if they need us?" But Miguel was right. By the second year, the hope had started to wear thin. Sarah was exhausted. Her job as a nurse barely held her together. Nights were the hardest. sitting in Jake's empty bedroom, his baseball cap still hanging from the bedpost, his schoolbooks still stacked neatly on the desk. By the third year, the legal system began to press in. Insurance companies grew impatient. Normally, families had to wait 7 years before a missing person could be declared legally dead. But in cases involving dangerous circumstances, like the Smoky Mountains, exceptions could be made. Sarah resisted. Signing that paper meant admitting it was over. But in 2022, nearly 4 years after the disappearance, she gave in. She sat in a courthouse, listening to the judge declare her ex-husband and son legally deceased. The words made her stomach turn. Soon after, the insurance company paid out David's $200,000 life insurance policy. Sarah used it to pay off her mortgage and put the rest in savings. But the money felt tainted, blood money for a tragedy she still couldn't understand. By year 4, grief consumed her. Counseling helped some, but the questions never went away. Where were they? Why hadn't a single trace been found? And if David had planned something, why? Meanwhile, the rest of the world moved on. But Sarah didn't. She couldn't. Then came year 5. By 2023, most people had stopped asking about the Martinez case. It was a mystery buried under hundreds of others. A cold case. Another sad story swallowed by the Smokies. Until one ordinary autumn afternoon, when a graduate researcher launched a drone into the sky. And what her camera captured would unravel everything. The year was 2023. Nearly 5 long years had passed since David and Jake Martinez had walked into the Smoky Mountains and vanished without a trace. For most people, their story was nothing more than a fading headline, a sad memory buried under newer tragedies. But for Sarah, every day still began and ended with the same aching question. Where are they? And then, completely by chance, a crack of light pierced through the darkness. On October 9, 2023, Emily Carter, a graduate student at the University of Tennessee, hiked into the backcountry with a project that had nothing to do with the Martinez case. He wasn't a detective. She wasn't a searcher. She was an environmental researcher studying erosion and water flow. Her tool was a high-tech drone with both thermal imaging and HD recording. Emily had flown her drone dozens of times before, mapping riverbeds and vegetation. But that afternoon was different. The air was sharp with autumn chill, and the mountains were dressed in gold and crimson leaves. She set up on a ridge that few hikers ever reached, lifted the drone into the sky and guided it over the vast wilderness below. For nearly an hour, there was nothing unusual, just endless ridges, steep valleys, and seas of trees that rolled like green and red waves to the horizon. Then, at the edge of a shadowed ravine, something caught her eye. At first, she thought it was nothing, just tangled brush. But as the drone dipped lower, her brow furrowed. The outline was too deliberate, too structured. She zoomed in further and her chest tightened. There, hidden in the hollow of the valley, was a shelter. It wasn't natural. Branches had been stacked deliberately, lashed with rope. A faded blue tarp sagged across the top, weather-beaten and torn but still clinging to its frame. The kind of structure someone might build if they were trying to survive. Emily's pulse quickened. She dropped the drone lower, adjusting the angle. That's when she saw them, the objects scattered in the dirt around the shelter. A rusted camping stove, its metal corroded with time. A child's bright red backpack, sun-bleached, half-buried beneath leaves. And then, a tiny shoe. Emily's breath caught in her throat. A child's shoe left out here 5 miles from the nearest marked trail? It didn't make sense. She replayed the footage, zooming in frame by frame. The shape of the backpack. The size of the shoe. A shiver raced down her spine as realization hit her. This wasn't just some forgotten campsite. This could be it. This could be the Martinez site. Her hands trembled as she packed up her equipment. She didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. By nightfall, park authorities had her footage, and within 24 hours a specialized search team was dispatched. But this wasn't a large-scale public operation like before. No cameras. No press releases. Just a quiet, controlled mission with only a handful of rangers who knew exactly what they were looking for. They hiked for hours, moving deeper and deeper into the Smokies. The air grew heavier as they descended into the ravine, the trees so dense that sunlight barely reached the ground. The silence was unsettling, no bird song, no rustling leaves. Just the crunch of boots and the sound of their own breathing. And then through the trees they saw it. The tarp. Torn and sagging but unmistakably human-made. The shelter. Collapsed in places but still standing after years of weather. The backpack. Still red, still child-sized, lying in the dirt like it had been dropped yesterday. The rangers exchanged looks, grim, uneasy. They had all heard the stories. Now they were standing in the middle of them. One ranger stepped forward, brushing aside leaves and moss near the base of the shelter. His gloved hand caught on something hard. He pulled gently and unearthed a small waterlogged notebook. The cover was cracked, the pages swollen, but the name written on the inside was still visible. Read, David Martinez. The forest stood silent around them as if it too was holding its breath. Because if David's journal had survived here for 5 years, what else might still be waiting to be found? When the rangers placed the worn, water-damaged notebook on the table, the room grew silent. This wasn't just evidence. This was the first real voice of David Martinez since the day he disappeared with his son. The cover was warped, its binding swollen from years of rain and snow, but somehow, miraculously, dozens of pages were still intact. Investigators treated it with extreme care, laying it open under soft light, blotting the damp paper until the faded ink began to appear. Slowly, David's story emerged. The earliest pages carried the optimism of a father on an adventure. October 12, 2018. Finally here. Jake was excited when we passed the falls. He said the water looked like glass breaking. He wanted to keep climbing, so we did. No rush. Just us and the trail. The handwriting was steady, controlled. David described Jake laughing, skipping rocks, asking when they'd see a bear. He noted that the phone was turned off, something that struck investigators. Why would he deliberately write that down unless it mattered? By the second day, the tone shifted. October 13th. We should have reached the overlook by now. Took a wrong turn, I think. Tried to backtrack, but the trail doesn't look the same. Jake's tired. Said his stomach hurts. Still have food, but not much. The letters were a little more hurried, pressed harder into the paper. 2 days later, desperation began to seep through the ink. October 15th. Storm came through. Everything soaked. Matches ruined. Can't get a fire going. Jake cried most of the night. He misses his mom. I told him stories until he fell asleep. Wish she was here. The investigators paused here. On that very same night, dozens of volunteers had been camped out only a few ridges away. Helicopters had circled overhead. Search dogs had combed the nearby valleys. Yet David and Jake, alive, shivering, writing in this journal, remained invisible. The entries grew darker. October 16th. Heard something last night. Branches snapping. Thought it was a bear at first, but it stopped when I called out. Didn't feel like an animal. Jake said he heard it too. We're not alone. One ranger later admitted, when I read that line, my blood ran cold. He wasn't talking about hikers. He was talking about something else. The handwriting by this point was uneven, almost frantic. October 17th. Jake is weak. Won't eat. Keeps asking when the rangers will find us. I told him soon, but I don't believe it anymore. Every direction looks the same. Every path leads back here. This place is wrong. October 18th. I don't sleep anymore. I see shapes in the trees at night. Lights too, small, flickering, moving between the branches. Jake says he sees them as well. Are we losing it? Or is something out here? Searchers exchanged uneasy looks. Lights in the woods. Hallucinations were possible under starvation and exhaustion. But why did Jake claim to see them too? The final entries were written in a rushed, jagged scrawl, words smeared by rain and tears. October 19th. No food. Jake barely talking. Keeps staring at the trees. He told me someone is watching us. I hear whispers too, like voices on the wind. When I shout back, everything goes silent. And then, the last line. The words that would haunt everyone who read them. If anyone finds this, don't follow the river. Don't. That was it. The journal ended abruptly. No goodbye. No explanation of what happened next. But the implications were chilling. Investigators stared at the final warning. Why the river? The original search teams had scoured the waterways extensively. If David was trying to leave a clue, it suggested he'd seen, or experienced, something terrifying there. And yet, despite the journal's disturbing tone, one detail stood out even more than the entries themselves. There was no sign of blood, no sign of violence, no sign of death. The shelter was empty. the backpack untouched. And neither David nor Jake's remains were anywhere in sight. The journal proved they had survived for days after the search began. But it also opened up far darker possibilities. Had David deliberately led his son deeper into the wilderness, trying to vanish forever? Had they fallen victim to someone, or something, out there? Or had David been losing his mind, with Jake suffering alongside him, until the mountains claimed them both? And just when the rangers thought the journal was the final piece of evidence, one of them, searching the perimeter of the site, unearthed something half buried in the soil. A metallic object. Heavy, its edge rusted but unmistakable. A hunting knife, wrapped in cloth, stained with something dark. And suddenly, the mystery of the Smoky Mountain disappearance shifted from a survival story to something far more sinister. When the ranger's shovel struck something metallic, the sound echoed strangely against the quiet forest floor. At first he thought it might just be a rusted tin can, an old hunting cartridge, or scrap left behind by careless campers. But when he crouched down and brushed the dirt away, his breath caught. Half buried beneath roots and damp soil lay a bundle, canvas cloth frayed at the edges, tied tightly with a piece of sun-bleached cord. It wasn't random litter. It looked intentional, almost ritualistic, as though someone had wanted it hidden but not lost. The ranger's pulse quickened. He radioed for Detective Maria Santos before touching anything else. When she arrived minutes later, she crouched low, her gloved hands steady. Carefully, she cut the cord and peeled back the canvas. Inside was a knife. A large hunting blade, once sharp, now dulled with time and exposure. The handle was wooden, darkened from years of use. The blade itself bore streaks of rust, but also something else. Stains that had seeped deep into the grooves. Dark, brownish red. Maria's face hardened. Bag it. No. No one touches it barehanded. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the knife was sealed in evidence plastic, tagged, and carried out of the woods. Days later, the forensic results came in. What they revealed sent shockwaves through the investigation. The stains weren't just soil or rust. They were blood. And not just any blood. The DNA showed a partial match to Jake Martinez. The news hit the Martinez family like a sledgehammer. Sarah Martinez, Jake's mother, collapsed when detectives told her. She had clung for years to the hope that Jake and David might somehow be alive, hidden away, waiting to be found. The idea that her son's blood had been discovered on a weapon buried in the woods was unbearable. But worse still, the knife also bore fingerprints. 2 distinct sets. One belonged to David Martinez. The other was smaller, lighter, incomplete. It belonged to Jake. This revelation tore open the case in ways no one expected. For 5 years, David had been seen by the community as a flawed but loving father, a man who may have led his son into danger but who would never hurt him. Now, with the knife's evidence, that image cracked. Theories spread like wildfire. The descent into madness theory. Some investigators believed David had lost his grip on reality out there in the wilderness. The journal's strange passages, about being followed, about voices and lights in the trees, were no longer read as paranoia of an exhausted father, but as the ramblings of a man who had already crossed into violence. Had David used the knife to harm Jake, then hidden it out of guilt? The outsider theory. Others clung to the idea of a third party. Could the shapes in the trees David wrote about have been real? Another survivalist, perhaps violent, or someone living illegally off-grid? If so, had they attacked the pair, leaving David to bury the weapon to cover his tracks, or even under duress? The mercy theory. A haunting possibility whispered among detectives. What if Jake had been injured, seriously, fatally, and David used the knife in an act of mercy, not malice? Was the journal his way of explaining the unexplainable? But then, why hide the knife? Why not leave it or mark the spot for rescuers to find? The journal itself took on new weight. Passages once dismissed now felt ominous. Jake, barely talking, keeps staring at the trees. We're not alone out here. Don't follow the river. Were these a father's protective warnings? Or his guilty conscience bleeding through in cryptic notes? Detective Santos couldn't let go of the implications. She ordered another sweep of the site where the knife was buried. That's when investigators noticed something they had missed before. A shallow depression in the ground, barely noticeable beneath moss and leaves. It wasn't deep enough to be a grave, but the earth had been disturbed. Samples of the soil were tested. The results came back chilling. Traces of the same DNA as the knife. This wasn't just where they camped. Something had happened here. Something violent. When Sarah Martinez was shown the evidence, the knife sealed in its plastic case, her reaction was raw, visceral. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "David would never hurt Jake. Never. He loved him more than life. If his fingerprints are there, it's because he used it to cut firewood or food, not that." Her denial was both heartbreaking and telling. For Sarah, the evidence wasn't proof of guilt. It was proof of how little anyone truly knew about what had happened in those woods. But the fingerprints complicated everything. If Jake's prints were on the knife too, it opened terrifying possibilities. Had Jake held it to help with camp chores? Had he defended himself from someone, or something? Or was it evidence of a moment no one wanted to imagine? Father and son locked in a struggle, ending in tragedy? Detective Santos later wrote in her report. This was the moment the Martinez case shifted. It was no longer about a disappearance. It was about survival, trust, betrayal, and possibly a final act of violence between father and son. And yet, even as the knife seemed to answer questions, it raised many more. Why bury it? Why wrap it so carefully in canvas and cord like a ritual? If David was guilty, why leave behind a journal that painted himself as protective, fearful, and desperate? If he wasn't guilty, then who or what had forced him to act? For a brief time, the knife became the centerpiece of the investigation. But it was only a prelude. Because just when it seemed the mystery had reached its darkest point, investigators unearthed one final piece of evidence. Something that would shatter every theory they had built. And it was buried not in the dirt of the forest floor, but in the very last pages of David's journal. The journal, weathered and warped by years in the elements, had become the beating heart of the Martinez mystery. Investigators had cataloged each entry, piecing together David's mindset from hopeful determination to creeping paranoia. But there were still blank, muddied pages at the back, smudged with water, nearly unreadable. For weeks, forensic analysts worked to restore the faded ink. They used infrared scanning, digital overlays, and chemical treatments to lift the words from the paper's ruined fibers. Slowly, like a ghost emerging from fog, the last entries came into focus. And what they revealed was darker than anyone had imagined. Entry, December 6, 2018. Jake is coughing again. Fever. He keeps asking for mom. I told him we'll be home soon. I have to believe it. Entry, December 9, 2018. Food is almost gone. I found berries, but I don't know if they're safe. He begged me not to eat them. He said the trees told him not to. Detectives paused at this line. The trees told him not to? Was this David projecting his paranoia onto Jake? Or had the boy truly been whispering such things? Entry, December 11, 2018. Voices last night. Not animals. Human. I shouted for help, but Jake grabbed my hand, begged me not to. He said, "They're not here to help, Dad. He's just a boy." How could he know that? Unless... Entry, December 14, 2018. Jake's getting weaker. He won't eat. I caught him staring at the knife. He asked me, "Would you ever leave me here, Dad?" I told him no. Never. But I don't think he believes me anymore. By this point, investigators realized the journal wasn't just a survival log. It was a slow descent into psychological collapse, whether David's, Jake's, or both. Then came the final entry. Entry, December 17, 2018. They found us. Lights between the trees. Jake tried to run, but I held him. I told him to stay quiet, not to look. He cried, "I want Mom." I said, "I do too." The lights are closer now. I can't protect him anymore. I don't know what's real. I don't know who to trust. If you find this, forgive me. And beneath those words, barely legible, a final line scratched into the paper with what looked like the very tip of the knife. Don't follow the river. The journal closed with that warning. No explanation. No resolution. Just a desperate father's final words written on the edge of delirium. When investigators presented these pages to the Martinez family, Sarah broke down in tears. David wasn't a killer, she insisted. He was scared. He was trying to protect Jake from something. You can't read those pages and think otherwise. But others disagreed. The imagery of lights, voices, and paranoia suggested a man unraveling under hunger, exhaustion, and fear. The knife, the buried evidence, and Jake's DNA all pointed to the possibility that David had become dangerous. Detective Santos, however, kept circling back to the same detail: the voices and lights in the woods. She spoke to veteran park rangers, asking if anyone had reported strange activity in that region before. Quietly, off the record, a few admitted hikers had told unsettling stories: glimpses of figures in the fog, lantern-like glows moving where no trail existed, and the sound of human footsteps at night where no other campers were known to be. Most dismissed these accounts as tricks of the wilderness. But for Santos, the overlap with David's words was too specific to ignore. In the end, the case file was left open. The evidence pointed in two terrifying directions. Either a father had harmed his son in an act of desperation, or both had stumbled onto something in the Smoky Mountains that no one wanted to believe existed. The journal was archived in evidence storage, sealed in a climate-controlled case. The knife was locked away too, its bloodstains still a chilling reminder of how close the truth had come. But the questions remained. Why was the knife buried so carefully? What, or who, were the lights in the trees? And most importantly, what truly happened to David and Jake in the winter of 2018? To this day, their bodies have never been found. And the Smoky Mountains, vast and unyielding, continue to guard their secrets. And so the Martinez mystery remains unsolved. Was this the story of a father losing his mind in the wilderness? Or a warning of something much darker hidden within the Smokies? Let me know what you believe in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more mysteries that refuse to stay buried.